Hey everybody, and welcome to Spin Legal. It's Wednesday evening of 6:15, and therefore it's Spin Legal time, right?
Yep.
Okay, and tonight we're going to be talking about provincial human rights codes. Okay, so if you need to contact Invictus Legal, you can do so on 905-688-5598. Email Angela at weareinvictus.legal or me at peter@weareinvictus.legal, or you can get on the website at weareinvictus.legal. Thank you. Okay, so we were talking stuff about federal human rights last week, weren't we?
Yep. And charter rights.
And charter rights, yeah. Now, of course, now we're going to be talking about provincial human rights codes and what are they and why do they exist?
Yeah. Well, provincial human rights codes are basically where you want to deal with somebody other than government, as well as government too in itself, because the Crown is also covered under human rights codes. If you're dealing with, say, an employer, if you're dealing with your landlord.
Yeah, because a government body is an employer, so you could be working, you work in Ontario for the federal government.
Yep,
For
exactly.
example.
Well, if you're working for the
therefore,
federal government, it would be under the Canadian Human Rights Act.
Yeah.
Hey, if
Well,
you're
certainly
filing
you'd be covered under both, under certain things under the Human Rights Act,
Yeah.
and other things under the Ontario Human Rights Code.
The Ontario Human Rights Code also too covers things like if you're in a workplace and you're getting harassed, like sexually harassed by somebody, or even harassed because of racial reasons or any other reason, where it's where you're under a code protected area.
I don't like.
Complaint.
Yeah. So the kind of thing which is, I don't like people from China. It's
Making statements like that is also racially or ethnically barred. Like, for example, in employment, you have a right to equal treatment with respect to employment without discrimination because of race, ancestry, place of origin, color, ethnic origin, citizenship, creed, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, age, record of offenses, marital status, family status, or disability.
So that's pretty well everything that's in Section 15 of the Human Rights Act, isn't it?
Yeah. It doesn't include people with blonde hair. It doesn't include people with blue eyes.
So does that mean I can discriminate against blonde-haired people?
Nope. I would probably not want to do it because they'll probably find some reason why you shouldn't be. Maybe because they're women or whatever. I don't know. Yeah.
Oh no, but I know some blonde-haired guys.
Yeah.
Got some friends who are blonde-haired, so hey, don't say a word against them.
Yeah, and then there's also things about gender discrimination in the like with respect to accommodations. Like a landlord cannot discriminate against you on all those grounds in accommodations, nor could they harass you on certain basis in there. Like, say, if you are in part of a same-sex couple, they cannot harass you, and or in workplaces for the same reason.
But again, there's nothing. You talked about a same-sex couple versus a different sex couple. So, a normal straight couple coming in to see a property that you're that you're renting out and you're the landlord, and hey, I come along with my husband, and and you say, you kind of, so long as you don't say openly, oh, I'm not going to rent to Peter and his husband, if you were to think, well, I like Mary and Joseph, good straight couple, they seem reliable, I 100% like them.
Where this becomes a problem, Peter, and where it becomes more obvious is, say, for instance, the unit that's being rented out is a one-bedroom unit, and then two men come in to rent out the unit. Okay? Yeah. And then they say, and the guy says, well, you don't have enough bedrooms. You don't have two bedrooms. or trying to imply that, okay, are they gay? That sort of thing. And
Yeah.
so that type of thing, it might become an issue.
Well, yeah, but again, you wouldn't know. If the landlord doesn't say anything but gives it to Mary and Joseph, rather than Peter and Peter, you wouldn't. How would you know or be able to allege that there was discrimination going on?
Sometimes there's different ways you can conclude, because I had one person who was saying she was discriminated against because she was black. And then she was brought around the building and introduced to people, and she was viewing the units of only other white people in the units. And then she went back, and then her application, for whatever reason, got turned down. And then she started getting suspicious about that it was discrimination because she was black. Although I know the situation, it wasn't because she was black. But she pushed it all the way up on the human rights chain. And
Mm,
this sometimes what happens is people want to avoid litigation. So a lot of times people do give a payoff.
yeah.
And it's not what I would recommend, in these types of situations, but some people are doing that, and this person could be going to another building and doing the same thing. Okay? And this is how some people make money.
Well, yeah, okay, there is that, but also, putting aside people making money out of taking a landlord or an employer to court, it's a very difficult thing to actually know what's in the grant, in the person, in the employer's mind or in the landlord's mind, as to whether why they rejected an individual. They
Yeah.
might say, "Oh, well, Joe and Joe's credit card rating wasn't as high as Mary and John's."
And very much, and especially today with the housing crisis the way it is, it's landlords are asking a whole lot of information from potential tenants, and some of them are even asking 6 months rent up front,
Well,
which is
some of those
illegal. It's
questions,
illegal according to RTA, but this is what's happening.
yeah,
And what it does, it effectively closes off most rental units to low income people.
yeah. Well, and also closes off, very often they closes off to people who are on benefits.
Yep, exactly. So this
And
is, or they charge, or they deliberately will raise the rent up to a point of, say, $2,000 or $1,800 a month for this two-bedroom apartment, and they know people on ODSP aren't going to get more than so much money, so they make sure that they can't afford it. That type of thing it's like a constructive form of discrimination.
yeah,
And unfortunately, not all of it is part of discrimination. Some of it is because their
so
costs have gone up and people just took over as new landlords and they got a high mortgage. So some of that is an issue. But I think what needs to be considered is some of this stuff has to be looked at more particularly so that people have access to housing.
what you're saying here is the why they exist is to try to give some form of even playing field for people who need certain services, or for jobs, housing, and other things,
Hmm. Definitely.
to
So that
attempt
means
to.
that if you and I are applying for a job, and then somebody who's 20 years old is applying for a job, and so that they're not always going to particularly prefer the 20-year-old who's got more energy and is not fixed in their ways. They can
Yeah, but
brainwash.
again, the 20-year-old may not know the actual, may not have the experience in the business that you and I do.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly. So this is
we
where they
we
have to take
get a
some consideration.
problem. Yeah, we get a problem presented to us. We've kind of gone, well, I've done that 15 times before. The answer is ABC,
Mm-hmm.
right? And Angela might look at me and say, well, Peter, I don't agree with you. It's ABC. It's ABD. You
Mm-hmm.
know. And I might kind of go, well, yeah, you're making a reasoned argument there, but it doesn't really matter whether it's C or D that we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know.
So there might be a way, like when you're older, you develop what's called crystallized intelligence,
Yeah.
okay, which develops as opposed to other types, contextual intelligence and other types of intelligence that younger people have. But when you're older, you have this type of intelligence which is based on your knowledge
Yeah.
and your experience, where
Yeah.
you look at things and you say, well, you know, this happened to me before, and it looks like there's a lot of similarities, and this is what worked for me, okay? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay? And when you're older, you develop that, and it's there, and it's a very valued trait, although I think it's undervalued in the workforce. So age discrimination exists.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay. So, you know, we'll get onto that sort of thing a little bit later. Okay. So, how do these codes apply, and who is affected by them?
Okay, everybody is covered. Okay? And like I
Well,
said,
that's me. So that covers me. That covers you. That's Tom, Mary,
mhm,
Abdul.
yep.
Um, you know, and everybody else. Even if they come from, you know, unusual parts of the world. Even if they come from Mars and they're you know living in Canada, they come from Mars.
Well,
They are
ethnic origin.
treated equally.
Well, in the United States, they call them aliens. So okay, maybe they actually have them there. I don't know.
Well, the term alien doesn't actually mean people not of this planet. It means foreign people
Yeah,
in the original context.
yeah.
But yeah,
So here we have where we talk about employment and different things or services or whatever it is that you're looking at. It like there's different things that human rights code implies. It's services, accommodations, which is rental property,
yeah.
contracts,
So we're talking about circumstances
yeah,
here, things like
circumstances, employment, vocational associations, um, talking about various types of situations like that. Membership
okay, so
groups too. Like if you want to be a member of the golf club, that sort of thing. It tells you different things where, and there's different forms of and also belonging to a union. So there's various situations where there is some kind of organization that has some power to confer or deny. Okay? And then the grounds.
yeah, but a union um, typically was going to employ, you know, everybody who works for I don't know Stelco belongs to the union.
Yeah, but there are some unions that actually help you set up and put you into work. Okay? Or actors unions, different things like that, or some of the unions that are outside, like the UNA. So people join that, and then they put you into different workplaces. Okay? And I've known of a woman worker who worked for a long time with Leuna and other workplaces where they've had other issues, right? Because being a female and going into construction sites has its own
Yeah.
issues, right?
Well, I was going to say that because yeah, male female differentiations, particularly in things like heavy industry, have got to be a big issue even today.
Yeah,
Even
exactly.
with
And the
even
same
with
thing is
advanced,
nurse, where a
yeah,
man works in a daycare center. I've handled a discrimination case against a male who was the only male who worked in a daycare center where there's about 30 other women
yeah,
who was in place, and he experienced a considerable amount of discrimination. So this is where it is. And my son being, he's a nurse, male nurse. Like people always say, well, oh, he's a male nurse. Hey, why don't they just call them nurses?
it used to be years ago that having a male nurse was a dig at thing, you know, but now, you know, like nobody says female doctor, do they? And
No,
or
they
male,
don't.
you
They
know,
don't
why
say
should they be
female
saying
doctor,
male nurse?
female lawyer. They just say lawyer or
Yeah,
doctor or nurse.
yeah.
And that's what the proper terminology will be. So whether you're a man or a woman or anything else, and you just happen to be a nurse, you are a nurse.
Well, and it's like if you were in the trades, and for example, you're a welder, doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you
I
don't go
grant that.
female welder. Oh, we
Yeah,
got four female welders,
I
hey,
grant
but
there
the
are
rest of them
probably
are all welders.
yeah, I grant there are probably more female males doing welding than there are females doing
Yeah,
welding.
exactly.
Probably just the nature of the job, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this whole dynamic about how people identify people, where it's kind of this is what the Human Rights Code tries to imply. And then when you're in specific circumstances, like some people say, the white male has no rights, because I'm the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant cis male, I, I have no rights. Hey, that's not true. That's not true. See, when you're in a traditional power position, okay, you certainly are not in a position to be claiming discrimination. But if you're in a position where you don't have the power, you don't have the choice, and there are circumstances where there could be discrimination against you because you're male, or it could be discrimination because of your religious or your faith, which Jewish, for example, or it could be because you're white and they prefer black applicants, right? And there's really no reason for them to do so. They'd have to actually almost be a special program, right, to qualify out of that. Okay?
Well, there used to be in the United States. There used to be what they would call what they termed positive discrimination to encourage the growth of non-white people within certain professions, like lawyers and nurses and doctors and that sort of thing, to encourage growth in those areas and to technically reduce unemployment in the black community in that. But that things have changed. There is more employment of racial minorities in those areas. But yeah, it is argued today that actually that reverse discrimination is bad for
Yeah.
for the
And
country.
they do occur sometimes. And what has to be done is that when they go through a hiring process, there has to be set in place a neutral guideline for what you're hiring for. So
Yeah,
whoever comes in your door, they all get assessed under this neutral guideline.
yeah.
Don't think to yourself and said, "Oh, do we have enough blacks on our team? Do we have enough lesbian women on our team? Do we have enough like don't.
Well, I
You
was
have to look
thinking,
at how you build it. Like when
yeah,
we were building people coming in to become our associates or to become our students. I don't really care what race they come from. I never
yeah.
care. And I've always managed to have a good variety of people in here from various
Well,
backgrounds.
and you take, for example, Trudeau went into his government. He said, "I must have 50% women." It was like, and there are certain people out there, and I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but there are certain people out there. Was that certain allegations being made about wrong people being put into the wrong positions, the wrong jobs, because they were. It's like employing a transport minister that had no knowledge of transit systems
Mm-hmm.
because they wanted to employ a particular
Exactly.
person of a particular sex to do that job.
Yeah. And then you can't go back too far the other way too, which is what Trump is doing in the
Well,
States.
but I see what you get in government as being will have a tendency to sometimes you'll have more women in government than men, and sometimes you'll have more men in government than women. If
And
things
that
are
roles.
allowed to move naturally, and there's no reason, of course, why you can't have a female prime minister like we had in like Margaret Thatcher, or
Yeah.
there was one in
Tim
Canada.
Campbell here, even though she was like a prime minister for 5 minutes. Liz Truss. Liz Truss is yours.
Oh, she was Canada's Liz Truss, was she?
Yep.
Yeah. Um, and there's absolutely no, there's nothing right or wrong about having, a prime minister of either sex or of any racial background.
Race. They
The
have
point
different,
being is that
yeah,
you elect a prime minister because of their political background.
because of their
Um,
knowledge, political
yeah,
background,
yeah,
leadership skills,
yes,
and
exactly.
who they are.
Yeah,
And you
and
have somebody who could be like in the U.S. Like they've tried to. There many women have run and tried to run. We had Kamala Harris, who was the vice president,
Well,
under Biden.
she only lost by one in this last election last year. She only lost by 1.5%.
Yeah, exactly. And she performed well.
Yeah,
A very strong woman.
yeah,
And the thing is, I don't know how it is, but maybe like a lot of people know Trump, because he was the president before,
yeah.
so people know Trump, so they voted for him. And but
Well,
Kamala Harris, she was very good. She brought up a lot of votes.
yeah, and okay, so we're coming back to human rights codes and how they exist in Canada. So essentially, every province has them, don't they?
Yeah, every province has them, and they might call them the Human Rights Code. They may call it the Charter of Human Rights, the Alberta Human Rights Act. They Alberta, it's actually
And
used to be called the Individual
Quebec
Rights Act
Charter of
before it
Human
got
Rights and
changed.
Freedoms.
So there's various things. The human rights codes differ from the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada because the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is first of all, it's embedded into our Constitution of Canada.
Yeah,
And it also refers to certain rights that are not necessarily covered by human rights codes. These are rights that are related to the interaction with the state, like your legal rights,
yeah.
like against police, for example, in the court system, your equality rights to be treated equally before and
Well,
under law.
and for example, the Ontario Human Rights Code covers freedom from discrimination in respect of services, accommodations, contracts, accommodation of persons under 18, employment, vocational associations, sexual harassment, reprisals,
Mm-hmm.
and infringement. Infringement is prohibited.
Yeah. So these things where the Ontario Human Rights Code covers it, these are also, they cover the Crown. It's all bounding on the Crown, like services that the government
Yeah,
provides you. There's many things that are considered a service. For example, the delivery of ODSP services. There could be a human rights issue there. The delivery of other type policing, how they're dealing with you. So there's a lot of different things that people can go back and say that they're being mistreated. Police are stopping me all the time because I'm black. Okay, people who are on ODSP, they're maybe overseeing me and harassing me because I'm Muslim. Okay, so there could be different ways there that they'd have to prove their case. They can't just go in there and say, well, they're discriminating against me. These things you involve proof. When the Human Rights Code was formed in Ontario, they had different ways of how that was implemented. They had a Human Rights Commission, which you had to write to and apply to. And the Human Rights Commission at that time decided whether it was going to take on your case or not. And
mm-hmm.
it went to something called the Board of Inquiry, which
Okay.
is the tribunal that heard cases from the Human Rights Commission. So
So that's the forerunner.
they didn't have a right of audience for an individual.
Yeah, so that was the forerunner of the Human Rights
Yeah,
Tribunal of Ontario.
exactly. So then in 2006, 2007, they decided that they were going to modernize the Human Rights Tribunal process in Ontario, which I believe it was Bill 7, I believe. And then at that time, what happened was they're going to make it into more like a court. So I want to sue Peter because Peter's discriminating against me because of my gender. So I could take Peter to the tribunal, and I am a party and I have standing before the tribunal, and Peter has standing before the tribunal as a respondent. And then now it goes to the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, which has different processes and how it proceeds with these cases.
Yeah.
I think that's a healthier way of doing things. Some people want to scrap all of that and then say, oh, well, people should just go to court if they want to do this. Courts are horribly expensive.
Well,
Judges have too much, don't have enough time to hear these cases.
there's kind of 50-50 in that, because if you've got, let's say you've got an employment case, and and you're basically saying, well, I was discriminated against because of my race, just to take that the classic example, right? And you would be much easier, it would be much more efficient to take a case through the tribunal than it would through the courts.
Yeah.
Because what are you suing for? You're suing for discrimination that may or may not be proved, and going through the courts is a whole new ball game and a lot more expensive to do.
And it's a complicated thing when you're talking about, say, employment law. Okay, I'm going to give you a good example of the employment law. See, employment law, you have several different avenues to go through, and you really need to, if you're a paralegal interested in practicing employment law, you have to be very, very careful, because there's different avenues to apply a case through, and you really cannot be deciding to, I'm going to go through the Employment Standards Act, and at the same time I'm going to go to court, or I'm going to do the Human Rights Tribunal as well as go with the Employment Standards. You have to be careful, because you have to be careful which path you go through, because there's certain remedies that you can seek from each. Right? Sometimes it's better to go through employment standards, because there's very strict statutory rights, and going through the employment standards will work. But if you go through the courts, then it's going to be, there's other rights. Like, for example, if you go into the Human Rights Tribunal for an employment case, you're focusing on the discrimination aspect. You don't get time in lieu of notice like you would in a court. You get lost income, human rights damages, discrimination damages, and you get some out of pockets, and certain things get awarded. And sometimes there could be non-monetary penalties inflicted too as well. If you go through a court, you get, these are very precedent setting. You don't have to have human rights. You can still have human rights issues. You can ask for human rights damages through a court. But you want to talk about other things like constructive.
I'm suing you for 45,000 of other damages, and I might tack on 3,000 of human rights damages because I feel you breached my certain rights.
Yep. So these are handled very differently in a court than it would be in a human rights code. Same as in any other thing, employment standards branch or into WSIB. There's various processes. Okay? There are situations in WSIB when there's an injury in there that you do not have a right to sue your employer. Okay? Like especially in some cases of workplace bullying and abuse. Okay? Some cases you do have a right to sue. Okay? Depending on, there's a number of factors. You have to have certain factors in place, and you have to assess them and evaluate that when the case comes to you. So there's plenty of things that people can deal with in employment. That's actually the most prominent one that I get is employment. People are discriminated against employment. Services is another one where this is where you can't get into the store because they won't allow you in with your service dog. I can't get service at a restaurant because they won't allow me with my service dog, or I'm in a wheelchair, and then the waiter comes up and asks my husband what I want. Things like that are completely discriminatory.
Actually, it was an interesting one. Went into a car showroom. This is like 20 odd years ago. Went into a car showroom and with my wife, and first thing I said to the salesman is, my wife's buying the car. She wants something like this, I believe, right? And the guy is addressing all his remarks at me, not her.
Yeah. Exactly.
Do you know how long he lasted on that sale?
0 seconds.
About 30 seconds, and that's it. We're done.
Yeah, that's it.
And the 3 times I said, she's buying the car, not me.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. She's gonna have to like it before.
we had already gone through the specs of the car. We'd already talked about the car, and but she's the one who has to like it, not me. Yeah,
you can be driving it.
I may be a weekend driver, but I'm not the one who's going to work on it every day, you know?
Exactly. I mean, that's what that has to be. And same as if you're in a restaurant and you're in a wheelchair, and then they ask your spouse what you want. I mean, the person in the wheelchair is going to be eating it.
Yeah.
Ask them what they want, what they like.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do they want their steak done?
And that kind of thing is all exactly. Those are all discrimination factors.
Yeah, these are just different things that happen because sometimes it's by habit people have, but some things are more insidious, like if in an employment thing, like requiring everybody to have driver's licenses, even though you're not driving for the job, or requiring people to be Canadian citizens in certain instances where citizenship may not be necessary. There's a lot of different things.
There's a couple of things that probably are important to look at. Sexual harassment, right? Which can occur in things like employment. It can occur in accommodation, and it can occur in other areas as well. Those two being primary ones that it occurs. Oh, women can't buy a 4-bedroom home because they don't earn enough money type attitude.
Oh, yes.
Right. I'm sure that's been said before, right?
Yeah, there was one time women couldn't get credit. They had to rely on their husband's credit.
Yes, exactly. But of course, that's probably before this Human Rights Act came into place, right?
Yeah. The first one was written, I think, in 1961. Where they started moving in that, and they keep changing it periodically when new circumstances. There may be something coming up about genetic discrimination.
Well, I was going to say some of the other things that need to also be covered is things like, obviously, pregnancy is an issue.
Yep, pregnancy is. It's always been in it. Pregnancy is actually in there. It's under family status or gender.
Well, and again, in Ontario, there are certain rules about how much time you have off relating to your pregnancy and your employment.
I've had a case where the person takes off. I just announced that they were pregnant. Okay, they came to work and they announced that they were pregnant. The workplace says, "Oh, congratulations!" Blah blah blah. You know, and then within a few weeks, a number of people get laid off, including the pregnant person.
Yeah.
And then this is something you have to be really careful of. Even though you don't think you terminated the person because they're pregnant, but you have to be very careful when you're starting to lay people off.
It's kind of there's the door.
Yeah.
Right there. You know?
Employers have a hard time nowadays. I don't know if anybody even wants to be an employer anymore. Because
couple more things, obviously.
Hire staffing agencies, you'll get everything taken care of.
Okay, there's a few areas where we do need to discuss in relation to Ontario. 65 or over, you can't discriminate based upon that. Canadian citizenship. There might be some instances, like, for example, working for Elections Ontario, Elections Canada, where you need to be a Canadian citizen.
Yeah, Ontario too.
Yeah, that's true as well.
Yeah, because you have to be a Canadian to vote, and Canadian to run, and Canadian to work in an election.
Yeah. And for example, age over 65 is a right under Part 1 to non-discrimination because of age is not infringed where an age of 65 years of age or over is a requirement for qualifications or consideration for preferred treatment. In other words, you have a right to get a pension, for example.
Yeah. Like they say, how come all these people over 65 are getting money from the government just because they're 65 years old? Well, this is something that has been put, what we call a demogrant in Canada, if you're looking at social policy. And people over 65 were dealt with that. So since I think it was 60s, I believe, 50s or 60s, they started putting CPP in place for that. And the OAS. The OAS, I think, is a little older
Yeah.
than that because they wanted to make sure people had that. We're having too many seniors who didn't have any money and couldn't afford to work, couldn't work. Then there's talking about different types of discrimination, which is very important to look at. There's past and presumed disabilities. This is the right to equal treatment without discrimination because of disability includes the right to equal treatment without discrimination because a person has once had or is believed to have or have had a disability. That means a
That,
person doesn't actually have to have that disability. Like, for example, if you're walking into the office, and I assumed because you're walking a little bit wobbly, and I'm getting mad at you because, oh, this one's an alcoholic. He's drinking on the job. He's an alcoholic, and I'm assuming that he's an alcoholic, and that will impose that he will have to go for substance abuse treatment. Right?
when
And
in fact I haven't drunken a drop in the last 92 years.
yeah, you could be completely cold sober. See,
Yeah.
and there's people who are being diagnosed as having mental health problems on the job. Be careful. Be careful.
Well, especially if you're not, you may be the employer, but how can you designate, how can you define whether somebody's suffering a mental health problem? You're
Yep.
not a medical
Not a
practitioner.
medical specialist, but
Yeah.
if you see a person performing, like say if something affects a person's performance, somebody's falling asleep all the time at work, hey, for example, and then you try to address it, like he does too. I just have a bucket, fill it with water, and but say if you have somebody's falling asleep at work, you address it. You try to inquire, make some inquiries, and see if there's a problem. Is there something the employer can do to help you? Hey, are there some problems that might be leading to this? Hey, and if the person's having issues and they continue to have issues, then you might ask them if they could talk about maybe some way that they could be accommodated. Maybe you're asking them to like the work hours. Maybe your workplace starts at 8 o'clock in the morning, but this person really can't really get together by till about 11 o'clock. Some people are really have difficulty.
I've always found that to be odd because, to be quite honest, I've worked some pretty strange times of the day and
Yeah.
night. And for example, when I was about 20, my boss suddenly said to me, "Well, Peter, any chance you could go home and you can manage the printer tonight between midnight and 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, because we've got this massive print job. We just want to make sure that it actually continues going." And I said, "Yeah, of course I can do that." So here am I at 2 o'clock in the morning changing the paper on the printer to make sure it continues to go.
Sounds like me.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it was back in a day when they had to do these. It was an engineering company, so they had to do these for these big plans that they were doing for an oil platform. So so again,
These things are like, say, for instance, there could be issues where a person's working shifts. You might have
yeah,
a job where people are required to work shifts, but
yeah.
whenever they work the day shift, they start falling asleep on the job, but they're okay at night.
Well,
So then you have to inquire about whether shift work is really working for that person.
my son had this situation whereby he was working, and he would like work 3 days where it was 7 a.m. He started 7 a.m. till about 1 or 2 p.m. And then all of a sudden they would throw in 3 nights of 4 p.m. till midnight.
Mm-hmm.
And then well, but again, you'd be in a situation where you go 4 p.m. till midnight, and then his following shift the following morning is 7 a.m. till 2 p.m.
Yeah. And this is some people can handle it, some people can't.
Yeah.
Okay. And this has to be
Well,
reviewed.
he told me he could it was problematic for him, and
Yeah.
I said to him, well, it's illegal for one, but let's not go there,
Mhm.
right? because they've undercut the hours that he should be able to be
There
getting.
has to be a certain period of
Yeah,
time when you're able to be
correct.
home.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But I said to him, well, why don't you,
Self-employed. When you're self-employed, like you got to be the worst boss when you're self-employed.
well, what I actually said to him at the time was, okay, who likes to do 4 p.m. till midnight? He said, nobody likes to do 4 p.m. till midnight. I said, do yourself a favor, go volunteer to do permanent midnight shift.
Yeah.
Right. And he thought about it for a week or two, and he said, yeah, you know what? That's not a dumb idea. Takes it away from everybody else. There's suddenly there's nobody saying, I don't want to do the midnight shift, because they've already got now a permanent worker who does the midnight shift.
Yeah. Right? There are people who will do that, and
yeah.
I've heard of one woman who was a nurse. She worked like 4 p.m. till midnight or midnight to 8 a.m.
Yeah.
And she really liked that. She did not like the day shift too much. It was too stressful.
Yeah.
Working in the evenings and overnight, was great.
Yeah.
She felt like very refreshed. And that was given to her as a Human Rights Code administration. That was in Alberta.
Yeah.
Which was interesting. See, all these provinces like Alberta and Quebec, every province across Canada has some version of a human rights code. Some of them still have the commission style model. Some of them have the tribunal style model.
Okay, so one thing that has to be talked about in relation to Ontario's human rights code is undue hardship.
Yep, undue hardship, which is a
accommodation issue.
Yeah, like when you can't accommodate like where if you're going to accommodate a person, it becomes very difficult. Like where determining if undue hardship, for example, first of all, if a person under this act is not infringed for the reason that the person is incapable of performing or fulfilling the essential duties of a requirement of the job, attending for the job because of disability. For example, no matter what accommodation you give them, they can't do the job. And another type of accommodation is and they have to determine that there is a level of testing, and no tribunal or court shall find a person incapable unless it is satisfied that the needs of the person cannot be accommodated without undue hardship on the person responsible for the needs, considering the cost, outside sources of funding, if any, and any health and safety matters, if any. So those things, what they do, that's what they have to consider. And these things have good precedent about what is undue hardship. Okay, so if somebody was looking at what's undue hardship, they can go and look at the precedents.
Well, it's interesting that one of the first cases I encountered with one of the paralegals that I first did some work with, he had a human rights matter came up, and he gave me the situation. So first of all, the lady became the lady, due to old age, well, part of her old as she was aging, she was in a basement flat. And to get out of her basement flat, there are 2 steps down from her basement flat. So they made a request to the landlord to ensure that there were that they had smaller steps in order that she could to accommodate her.
Mm-hmm.
So what did he do? He didn't go from the standard size steps to slimmer steps.
He made bigger steps.
He made taller steps. Right? Issue number 1.
Yeah.
Issue number 2 is that he actually made the steps too narrow.
Oh God.
Right? So when he did make the steps the right size, they were way too narrow. You couldn't get your foot on them.
Oh my God.
Right? He was really going after this woman. And then when he did, he then took her parking space away. Disability parking away.
I hope he had some fun before the tribunal.
Well, the paralegal who was dealing with this case, he says, I'm just racking this up one issue at a time. I put a
Good,
new form in there into the
good.
tribunal every time.
Yeah, and yeah, because that would be just one of those interesting cases people have, right?
Yeah,
And a tribunal would determine whether there is undue hardship, and they would determine based on case law.
yeah.
Right? It's not
There
something
are
I can
rules of
say. I've
yeah.
had
The case
I've
law.
had organizations tell me, "Oh, it's undue hardship. We can't do this." Hey, and I said, "Okay, you're gonna have to try to identify to me what the undue hardship is. What will
Yeah.
happen if you did accommodate the person like this?"
Well, for example, if you're talking about a small mom pup organization, employer, undue hardship might be if you had to pay out $25,000 worth to actually amend, to change all of the facilities in order to accommodate this person.
Mhm.
That may
Unless
actually
they
pay
can
much
get outside
more.
funding through, there are funds that
Yeah,
people can apply for.
of
Yeah.
course, but in one employer, undue hardship might be $25,000.
Yeah, exactly.
Another employer spending $10 million is
Peanuts.
peanuts. Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly.
Yeah. So I mean, this is where they do look at it, does take in consideration the the size of the employer. Same as the AODA, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. The Ontarians with Disabilities Act is very different. Like they do apply things like to education, digital space, employment, housing, different areas of life, transportation. So all of these things, they set standards, what all the buses have to look like and how they have to act in order to accommodate people with disabilities, how public buildings have to be in order to accommodate people with disabilities, how employers have to prepare for setting policies in place so that they're accommodating people with disabilities. So these are just standards. And a standard, they don't really have a complaint mechanism, but sometimes they could be utilized if they do have a standard in place, but the employer's not following it and having it. So there's
Mm.
ways that they can do that to challenge this.
Well, I was going to say there's a width for a wheelchair door, for example,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
and just being half an inch too narrow, the wheelchair might get through it, might,
Might. Yeah.
yeah, and but again, it might chop the operator's hands off in getting
Yeah.
through.
Exactly. So these are things that they do. Like I try to get, like in my office, for example, it's essential that if you're providing services to the public, whether it be legal services, therapy service, physiotherapy services, opticians, anybody who serves the public and are likely to encounter people with disabilities of any kind, it is best and publicly it looks good if you have a fully accessible quarters.
However, however, I have to say there are plenty of shops out there, for example, that you couldn't get a wheelchair into.
I know. And the thing is, they haven't yet made that standard, but I think it's going to come
Mm,
because, but a lot of professional codes of conduct, they require this.
yeah.
Like for example, one of the things is in the LSO, we have to make legal services available. That's part of our work. And by making legal services available, some of us do things through online through Zoom,
Yeah.
which sometimes could accommodate people. We also get an accessible office. Or if you're one who works from home, then you get an accessible office downtown when you can set up a meeting space. Okay? So these things you have to organize, okay? So that you're not only appearing professional, but also being accessible to all people. It's not just wheelchairs either, but there's also people who are blind. Okay? They need to have your retainer agreements or other paperwork sent to them by email so that they could read it through their screen readers. So
Hmm.
there's a number of things like that. People who have epilepsy, you're flashing your lights, your lighting.
Yeah.
your furniture. Yeah, there's things like that that have to be considered when you're in there. Contrast colors when you're in an office. So someone who may be visually impaired, they can tell which one's a doorway, which one's a stairway. They know their way around without tripping and falling or banging into things they're not supposed to. So contrasting in colors. So there's a number of things that people put in as accessibility codes to help people. Of course, a lot of people say, well, I don't want to spend all my money doing that just for one or two people who might come. What happens is if you make it known that your office is accessible and people know your office is accessible, they'll come. People will come.
We may only, ours are accessible. The upstairs where we used to be, we had problems insofar as there was no washroom that was accessible. Downstairs where we are now, we do have accessible washrooms.
Yeah, there's an accessible washroom just around the corner if they have to use the washroom for that. And then we also have two washrooms inside.
Yeah,
where we work.
Actually, the lady in the wheelchair actually told me at least one of them is accessible.
Oh, good.
Fulfills the criteria.
That she was able to use it. Good. Yeah, because this is one thing that I have always that kind of thing because what happens is if somebody's not offering you accessible services, complain about it. At least write them a letter and saying that you can't use their services because they're not accessible.
Yeah.
Let them know that they need to
the only thing, of course, about that is the washroom was accessible insofar as they could get their wheelchair in there, but the wash basin was too high.
Yeah.
But that is she told me that, but it's like she said, you know what, 90% of places are even worse.
Yeah, exactly. We try to do our best with this, and I didn't build this, but we did do some design in the place, which is okay.
Yeah.
But it's just the thing that we want to make sure that that this works. And I've been to doctors' offices too. Doctors' offices are constantly being jabbed at for inaccessibility.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And getting on top of the thing for the doctor to examine you, there has to be some way for people with disabilities to get on. So these are things that things like the AOTA is trying to address. Unfortunately, like we were all supposed to be accessible as of January 1st, 2025. Okay? And unfortunately, we're not even near there. Okay? When the AOTA was first passed. I think that each subsequent government since it was started should get their big slap on their wrist, big time, because they should have done this. And we have the Accessibility for Ontarians Act Alliance, which has been very critical of that. And we've had four reports when they were supposed to examine this, and not a single government has actually moved towards achieving these goals. And they have to. They should. Okay? Start with the public service, then get larger companies, then the smaller companies will follow, and figure out how to help the smaller companies comply. Because sometimes they might need a few funds or something to redress a building issue or something.
Yeah. Okay. So we've covered quite a bit of Ontario's Human Rights Code. Any other points that we might want to consider before moving on?
No, that's pretty good.
Okay, so let's move on. Let's move on for a moment to Quebec. The Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms.
Like the Quebec's almost looks like a combination between our federal charter and a human rights code type of effect in Quebec.
Yeah.
So this is really weird, and it's very much on a civil code. They actually have political rights, and it cannot be discriminated against on political opinions. And they also talk about legal rights and various legal and democratic rights, which is very interesting because we don't have that in Ontario. We just have the Charter of Rights.
Yeah, and for example, the one that I was intrigued by, and this is what I come across when I was looking at my law degree back in the day. Every human being whose life is in peril has a right to assistance. There's actually a difference between Ontario law and Quebec law here. You're walking, there's a guy drowning in a river over there. In Ontario, you look at the situation, you go, holy moly, he's drowning. But you then sort of look at it and go, yeah, but if I go and save him, I'm going to drown.
Yep.
Right. So
but in Quebec, you got to jump in and drown yourself. So
yeah,
you save this one guy who's drowning, so that he'll probably drown anyway.
And this, unfortunately, comes from French law.
French law. Is this what French law is all about, Peter?
Well, every person has a right to live in French, or to the extent that provided in the Charter of the French language.
Oh, yes. Right to live in French. Oh, my God. I think in French sometimes because I've had bilingualism, but to live in French, I don't know.
Yes, and there's an interesting one. They use a few words here. A person's home is inviolable, and
inviolable.
Inviolable. Just in case you didn't know what that meant, refers to a fact of being secure from violation, profanation, and meaning it must be respected and not removed or ignored. And there's an interesting fact about that one, is that it almost when it comes to human persons, a person possesses judicial personality, and that judicial personality is known as artificial personality or juristic personality, and refers to legal status of non-living entity, and is treated by law as having personhood. So it treats corporations the same, right?
Yeah, it's just amazing how they kind of put their own charter in place. This was done before our charter was introduced in Canada.
Yeah, 1975 this was put in place.
Yeah, and ours was 1982.
Yeah. Well,
so
no, the country,
how they've done this, and I guess what they've done is they did their own, and then they refused to sign our charter. So I guess they had their own.
Well, I think to some extent the charter, the Quebec Charter, differs, is based to a large extent upon the French interpretation of the Universal Code of Human Rights.
Yeah.
Universal Charter of Human Rights, I mean. The English version is different, and it's a lot to do with the linguistics.
Yeah.
But it's not all linguistics, because, as I said, that ability, that rule about having to save a drowning person, in Ontario, it's permissible just to call the police. In Quebec, you've got to call the police and jump in.
Yeah, this is always interesting when you have this kind of thing, because this is a very interesting example of how Quebec is different than the rest of Canada. But then they also always had a very different charter, very different culture, and how they laid things out. And we kind of have your Quebec accommodation type of thing within our government, because Quebec was also from a very different standpoint. They follow the civil code as opposed to the common law code. So there's a lot of differences.
And in part, the thing about the civil code and common law code is that under common law, if a word has been defined under a judicial ruling, that definition stands even 300 years later. Whereas under civil code, that definition depends upon the judge who's hearing the case at the time.
Yep. So it just looks at here.
But again, what are you looking for?
I'm just looking at various things. People have a right to have a standard of living and Wow, this is almost taken from the international human rights. Some of it. It's probably been based on that.
Which section is that?
I was just looking here on economic and social rights. There was a lot of
Oh,
discussion
okay.
about that by making our charter be implemented using economic and social rights. And there's a lot of discussion about it, but nothing ever came of it, of course, like every time we try to change the Constitution.
Well, it's an interesting question because the thing is that economic and social rights, you see, we concentrate very much upon political rights.
Yeah.
We also concentrate on criminal rights, and particularly the right of the accused to get get assistance, and those kinds of rights. But economic rights, right of housing, for example, is something that is constantly referred to by those in the in who are concerned about homelessness.
Hmm. Yeah.
Right?
And right now, like they have things here, section 45 of their charter, every person in need has a right for himself and his family to measures of financial assistance and to social measures provided for by law, susceptible of ensuring such person an acceptable standard of living. Of course, they have courts probably determining it all which ways. There is a
Yeah, but
There was a Louis Goslin decision, which was one of the things that put some of that under challenge. Okay?
yeah,
But
and
but
and
it's very
like
interesting because we have nothing like that in our charter. Okay? Because everything in our Canadian charter is the right to be not bothered, not to be harassed, not to be penalized, not to be detained, all that kind of stuff. And here they're talking about not only negative rights like that, but they're also talking positive rights, which is
Right,
very
yeah, I
different.
was going to say, you're talking about positive rights. Here's another one. Every child has the right to protection, security, and attention. Note that third word. That his parents or the persons acting in their stead are capable of providing.
So every 2-year-old is going to read that and
Yeah.
demand it, that it
So
gets enforced.
it's no use to say, hey babes, go over there. I'm ignoring you. Just do your thing. I'm ignoring you. No, that's not permissible.
All you're going to do is the International Union of Infants and Toddlers will drag that Section 39 out and start enforcing it against you.
Yeah, but it's an interesting thing because that's actually where common law versus civil code has differences.
Yeah, yeah, and they just do this, and how people have a right to protection against any form of exploitation, whether you're an aged person or handicapped, Section 48, and that this and such a person has a right to the protection and security that must be provided to him by his or her family or by the persons acting in their stead. So, in other words, they need to be protected. But what if it's the family that's exploiting them? That's the other thing, which we've often seen cases of.
There have been distinct cases of that. I was watching a documentary about that in UK, and there were some very horrifying cases of become honor killings.
Yeah, honor killings,
Or
child abuse.
I would call them dishonor killings.
Yeah, dishonor killings, and then there's incest, child abuse, different things like that. How that would be, or elder abuse, where
Yeah,
financial abuse.
and okay, so every person, section 46, every person who works has a right in accordance with the law to fair and reasonable conditions of employment, which have proper regard for his health, safety, and physical well-being.
Yeah. So in other words, I can't. If I was an employer there, I can't be violating someone's rights to have a healthy and safe work environment. We can't in Ontario either.
Yeah.
But someone in Quebec, they have a lot more deeper rights where they have a lot more that they could.
Well, and actually, there's a difference between the way that civil codes are drawn up and the way that common law is drawn, English style law is drawn up. Basically, with civil codes, you have to if it is not included within the civil list of codes, then it is not a permissible thing to have happen. Whereas with
Can't add it
English,
in. Yeah. Whereas in a common law, you could add it in.
yeah, well, with common law, if it's not included, it's permitted.
Yeah.
And under civil codes, if it's not included, it's not permitted.
Yeah. Yeah. We have the thing here. It's very interesting, and they have a commission-based system too, which where they you go there and they will take this forward and on your behalf if they feel you have a case that could be taken. It's very interesting how that one works. The Alberta Human Rights Code was very interesting. Like as I said, it used to be
let's
called
move
the
to
Individual Rights Act in the 90s until like at that time they did not have anything in there protecting people from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And then somebody got fired from one of the school boards because he was gay, and he took it all the way up and it went into the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court wrote it in that it has to include sexual orientation. And that's where you get with our charter, that they're allowed to do that. And then this guy, his name's Vren. The case is called Vren, Briend. Okay?
yeah.
But
And under the Alberta Human Rights Act, the Code of Conduct talks about discrimination in terms of publication, discrimination in terms of goods, services, accommodation, facilities, benefits, minimum age for occupancy, discrimination regarding tenancies, regulations, equal pay, discrimination regarding unemployment practices, application of advertisements in employment, memberships of trade unions, prohibitions regarding complaints, etc., etc.
yeah. See, it looks like what happens in Alberta is that something happens and then they put it into law. Hey, which I like that, because it does include a few things that even Ontario doesn't have, but then again, Ontario does a lot of precedents, and then we kind of put it under things, or we put it under what we call
developing law.
Yeah, developing law for different purposes. Like we've had job ads that are very openly discriminatory. There's also apartment ads, no ODSP, no children, things like that. You can't do that. That's against the Human Rights Code.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say the other thing about Alberta is that they have a Human Rights Commission, and that's essentially it has a director and staff associated with it, and you can make a complaint, and the director's powers and duties regarding, to investigate, they can investigate, and they have powers to make rulings.
Yeah, so they are the ones that would have standing before a tribunal for the Alberta Human Rights Tribunal.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that would be a commission-based system, right? Like if an individual applies and said, I'm being discriminated against, right? They don't have standing unless they go through that commission.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying here?
That's, I think, what he's saying here. I'm just looking at the basic. I'm just looking at the basic structure of this particular report.
They seem to have a lot of significant powers here to investigate any kind of complaint.
Because there's a code of conduct, for example, discrimination regarding publications and notices. Right? There's a code of conduct for these things. Right?
Yeah, there is. Parties in the complaint. That any following people are parties to a proceeding before the Human Rights Tribunal, which means that they have standing for appearance. The complainant is not a party. It says the director, which probably refers to their commission.
Yeah.
Any person named in the complaint as the complainant, that would, or as the complainant, I think that they would be a party here. Any person named in the complaint who is alleged to have been dealt with contrary to this act. Any person in the complaint who is alleged to have contravened this act. So they do have something where you can have people go in there.
Yeah.
But it sounds like there's a lot more power given to their commission. Hey,
Yeah.
I'm just taking a look at this. I mean, I don't have all the answers about Alberta because I practice in Ontario, but it's a
Yeah.
very but it's always interested in looking at the different acts about how they do things. And
Well,
rights tribunals are interesting because they can award any amount of money that they could, what they want to. They don't have a limit like small claims court does or whatever. I think they could do that. Of
yeah.
course, they're based on precedent. Like they don't do two cases where one case gets $250,000 and the other gets 5,000.
Yeah.
They have to be based on similar cases.
Yeah. And there are regulations that that the lieutenant governor can actually make regulations
Yeah,
based on
yeah.
this act.
When you have things in the legislation, it's a lot more stronger,
Yeah.
okay? Because they have to go back to the legislature to change it. Okay? And then again, people have a right to oppose it and they can delay it, blah, blah, blah. They have to work with the other parties and get legal advice and blah, blah, blah. And then the regulations, they can be just written off by lieutenant governor and council.
Yeah.
Well, the cabinet minister who's in charge of it, usually the attorney general. Oh, let's just change this. Hey, the director, the commission having 9 people on it, let's just make it have 5. Different things like that. They can
Yeah.
change it.
Yeah. All right. We've kind of gone a quick skirt through, and we've gone over time here, because we're massively over. So I think that's just been a run through, and I hope everybody's found something in there that they can actually say, "Hey, I learned something today," because I did. I learned something today, and reinforce that, and it had that reinforced learning about the civil codes and how how they function. So here we go. So if you need to contact Invictus Legal, you can do so on 905-688-5598. Angela is at Angela at weareinvictus.legal, and I am at Peter at weareinvictus.legal. Our website is https weareinvictus.legal. All right. And most important item of the day, too, and you must remember, is this.
Yeah, and what you heard today at Spin Legal, whether it's in this show or in others in our series, this is not legal advice. And if you do need legal advice, then please contact a paralegal or lawyer. You cannot rely on the information here as specific legal advice.
Yeah. Or in Quebec, what are they called? The notaries.
Yeah, the notaries. Yeah, talk to them. Yeah, they seem to have some authority over there. So it's interesting.
Yeah. All right. So, well, thank you everybody for being here, and enjoy your week, and we'll see you next week, I guess.
Yep. Take care. We'll find another topic next week.